Anybody have anything earth-shattering at their table they might want to share with us right now? Come up. All right, let's get started here. Continue on with Noah. Noah Jansen is the restoration manager at Tip of the Mitt. Some of his responsibilities are dealing with invasive species, restoration of natural green belts, and shoreline protection work. I believe that Noah, you've been probably in all of these communities at one point or another around our lakes over a period of years, and have observed a lot of things. So would you please join us in welcoming Noah, giving us a little discussion here now about shorelines. You know, septic systems and shorelines related in a lot of ways, but septic systems we're always going to have. We need them. They're going to be around. So regardless of whether or not at this point, you know, you live on a lake, far from a lake, the septic systems are something that our society needs, you know, just like outhouses a long time ago. Eventually we may get to public systems, but let's just try to deal with them responsibly. And that's what we're talking about today. Noah?
Thank you, George. Just the first couple of slides are just some background about the Watershed Council. If you're not familiar with us, we're a nonprofit organization, and our service area is shown on the map here. We're very watershed focused, so you can see the map of the different watersheds here. And of course, we're in that light green one towards the bottom there, the Elk River chain of lakes. And I also like to acknowledge that we are in the traditional homelands of the Anishinaabe peoples, the Odawa, the Potawatomi, and the Ojibwe, and we will continue to partner with them to protect our waters for the next 7 generations. Okay, so that said, this is a picture of what most of our shorelines looked like, say 100 years ago, 150 years ago, before we had a lot of development. And what do you see here about this shoreline? Yeah, there's no homes.
Lots of trees.
Lots of trees, exactly. So, wetlands, yep. So all of those things were kind of present on our shorelines originally. And this is what the natural shoreline looks like. In a lot of cases, we either have wetlands or we have forest that comes right down to the water's edge. And in that forest, trees, of course, but we also have multiple layers of vegetation. So we might have trees, and there's understory trees below them. There's shrubs. There's ground cover and sort of low-growing plants as well. And all those things work together in combination to form stable, resilient shorelines. So if we move a little further through time, say around like the early half of the first half of the 20th century, moving up until like sort of World War II, 1940s, a lot of our lakes started to get some development, and we started to see sort of these small cabins, and in most cases they were pretty rustic. A lot of the natural shoreline vegetation was left in place. A lot of focus on like fishing and just sort of getting away to a quiet, natural environment. A lot of small lawns is another key feature of that, and that helped to preserve the shoreline from erosion. Moving forward in time, today a lot of our development looks more like these pictures here. We have very large homes in some cases. A lot of times there's lawn that goes right down to the edge of the water. All the natural vegetation has been removed, or most of it. And also the density of the development is quite dense in many cases. And this creates problems for our shoreline. So over time, you can see in this graph, we get an increase in water runoff from all those impervious surfaces, from our roofs, from our driveways and roads, and even from our lawns. that causes erosion on the upland parts of the property, and that creates sediment problems in the lakes. And we also get more phosphorus and nitrogen and nutrients that are feeding the growth of algae and nuisance plants in our lakes. So seawalls are kind of what most people think of when we think of protecting our shorelines from erosion, and they have been around for thousands of years, and they do protect the shoreline from erosion. So what's wrong with seawalls? So they can increase erosion on neighboring properties. So waves come in, they hit the seawall, and because the seawall is hard, those waves bounce off, and they bounce off in different directions. Sometimes they'll bounce off onto the neighbor's property, so if that's not protected in some way, you're exacerbating erosion on the neighbor's property. They also deflect some of that energy downwards towards the lake bottom, so you get increased scouring of the lake bottom. That can impact fish habitat as well as increase the turbidity of the water. In addition, seawalls are poor habitat for a lot of our wildlife species. If you think about things like amphibians and turtles, animals that spend part of their time in the water and part of their time on land, it's really hard for them to get up and down over a seawall. It becomes an impossible barrier. So this picture just kind of shows what I was talking about in terms of that wave energy being deflected towards the bottom and towards the side. So if seawalls are not the answer, what is our alternative? So there is an approach that the Watershed Council recommends called bioengineering, and we've been promoting this since the 1990s, when a former employee named Doug created a about bioengineering and how to restore shorelines in a more natural way. Bioengineering, or sometimes it's called biotechnical erosion control or natural shoreline approach, is basically a suite of techniques that uses natural materials to restore a more natural shoreline and create resiliency along the shoreline. It also avoids a lot of the negative impacts of more traditional shoreline erosion approaches like seawalls or large boulder riprap. I'm going to be working through a number of these different approaches with you today. First, I want to just point out that we adapt our techniques to the site based on the amount of wave energy that's coming in. And this is kind of a illustration of that. So on the low energy side, where we don't have a lot of big waves coming in, maybe we only need a green belt or a strip of native vegetation along the shoreline, and that will be enough to hold the shoreline in place and prevent erosion. If we get a little bit more wave energy coming in, there might be too much where we can't get new plants established there, and we might need a coir log or something similar to kind of break up that wave energy until we can get plants established. If on a bigger lake where that's maybe more than a mile across the water, for the waves to build up, we might need some field stone to help protect that shoreline in addition to the plants. So, and all these things are additive. So when we are talking about field stone or coir logs, we always combine that with the green belt. The native plants in the bioengineering approach are a critical component of creating that stable, resilient shoreline. And I'll also be talking about some other options that include encapsulated soil lifts, aquatic native plants, turtle logs, or fish sticks. And then, of course, all these things can be used in different combinations. Is kind of limited somewhat just by your imagination. So first, the green belts. This one is kind of a key approach here because it's the only one that's really preventative. So having a swath of native vegetation along your shoreline, those plant roots go down deep into the soil, they hold the soil in place, so when waves come in or ice comes in, there's something there holding the place. So holding the soil in place. So when people have, mowed lawn grass right down to the water's edge. Those roots are only going down like 3, 4, 5 inches deep. So a lot of times you'll see waves come in, they undercut that side, and you get slumping of the bank into the water, and you're getting erosion. The shoreline recedes year after year. And people wonder why. It's because they don't have deep-rooted native plants on the shoreline. So a good green belt will include sort of those multiple layers of vegetation, ideally, like I talked about in that first picture of the undeveloped shoreline. We've got our trees, we've got shrubs, we've got native grasses and sedges that are holding it in place. Some of the benefits of green belts is, one, it can reduce maintenance and maintenance in terms of time and cost. So, you know, there's kind of, they get the picture of the guy mowing his lawn right over the lake there. That's kind of, you know, that's kind of a hard spot to mow. So what if he had a green belt right there instead? That was actually helping protect his shoreline instead of, you know, going to all this trouble. They also, of course, provide habitat for wildlife. They can actually be a deterrent to Canada geese, which are a nuisance on so many of our lake fronts. So the geese, they love open expanses of lawn. They eat that lawn grass, especially during the times when they are molting or when they have young that can't fly yet. Those open lines of sight and easy access to the water is exactly what they're looking for. So if you have a green belt and your neighbor doesn't, you know, they're gonna steer away from your yard and go to the neighbor's yard where they have easier access to the water and can see longer distances. And of course, green belts can also be attractive. A lot of wildflowers and other native plants can be really beautiful. And of course, from a water quality perspective, the green belts are also filtering a lot of our runoff, so they're filtering out excess nutrients, they're filtering out pollutants from the upland, any pesticides that people may be using. The shoreline green belt becomes sort of that last line of defense, really, from any kind of pollution that's coming from the upland. And of course, they also prevent erosion, as I mentioned before, and protect water quality, and that's really why people come to the lake. It's because of the water quality. Here's a picture. You can see sort of the difference between some of our horticultural species on the left. Their roots are only going down maybe a foot and a half. The Kentucky bluegrass, of course, is only going down a few inches, and then compared to our native plants, especially many of our prairie species, are very deeply rooted, up to 8 to 10, or even deeper roots in some cases. These are a couple of pictures of what greenbelts can look like. So on the left, there is what we call a no-mow zone. In this case, somebody just decided they were not going to mow along the right up to the edge of the water anymore, and they allowed some of the native plants that were already in the soil seed bank or that came in from outside to reestablish over time. Then on the right, we have a more landscaped approach where this was actually a planted greenbelt, and the homeowners used some cultivars of native species. So there's like a burgundy colored 9-bark in there. There's some marsh milkweed, some Joe Pye weed, some more showy flowers as well. One of the key things people want to know often about greenbelts is how big do they need to be? And the answer generally from our perspective is we don't have a set recommendation for that. It kind of depends on the site. More is better is the general rule of thumb. So when I come out to a homeowner's house and make recommendations to them, it's kind of a bit of a discussion of how much lawn are you willing to give up, basically. And ideally, we like to see a greenbelt that extends across at least 75% of the width of the property, and 20 to 35 feet back from the top of the bank is kind of the minimum that we're looking for. But I'll work with homeowners. Some people don't have that much space. Depending on how far their setback is. So, anything that people can do is an improvement. A variety of factors can influence the effectiveness of green belts, such as, what's the slope there? So if you have a steeper slope, that's gonna, have less time for water to infiltrate into the soil and get filtered by the green belt. What's the type and density of vegetation? And what's the amount of impervious surfaces that is, flowing runoff, feeding runoff towards the lake that the green belt actually has to filter. Also, it depends on, what's your goal for the green belt. So for things like stream belt stabilization and water temperature modulation, especially along streams, like you don't need to have a super wide green belt, maybe that's sort of that 20 to 35 feet. But if you're talking about things like wildlife habitat or nutrient removal, having a wider green belt is really beneficial. Again, when we're talking about green belts, the composition of that vegetation matters. So we like to focus on what we call our workhorse species, and these are things like the grasses and the sedges, rushes, a lot of our shrubs like willows and ninebarks and dogwoods, trees of course as well. People are often very interested in having the flowers because they're showy and beautiful to look at, but in terms of the function of the green belt and preventing erosion, a lot of them are more shallow rooted. Some of them are deeply rooted, but we do like to make sure that there's a good complement of those workhorse species in there as well. Okay, so moving along a little bit, sometimes, as I said, we have enough wave energy coming in that maybe it's hard to get native plants established if we want to create a new green belt. So we can use something called a coir log or a coconut log, biolog, and this is basically a cylinder of coconut husk fiber that's encased in a netting of that same material. And you place these along the shoreline, generally parallel to the shore, and stake them in. And they're biodegradable, but they last for about 6 to 10 years, and they just provide a temporary protection of the soil behind there, which allows the native plants to get established. So over time, the coir log is breaking down, and the native plants are getting established, their roots are growing, they penetrate into that coir log and eventually grow into that as well. Here's just a couple of pictures of what that looks like if you haven't seen one before. So they come in different diameters from 12 to 20 inches typically. So on the right here, you can see the coir log is right along the water, and then the native plants have been planted behind there in a erosion control blanket. And sometimes coir logs alone aren't enough, especially on some of our bigger lakes where we have bigger waves coming in. Once you get to where you have over a mile of fetch is just the longest distance across the water from your house. Then once you have over a mile, then we're kind of getting into this higher energy design where you might need some fieldstone, as well as that coir log and the native plants to restore your shoreline. Key components here, one is the slope. So we really recommend having a 4 to 1 or gentler slope. So this is for every 4 feet you go out horizontally, that corresponds to 1 foot of vertical height change there. The toe stone is another key feature, so those are usually our biggest stones, and those are partially embedded in the lake bottom, and hopefully ideally they have a sort of a flat surface that leads up to form the base of that ramp. We use a combination of different rock sizes, and those are based on the size of the waves that we see. There's bigger stones, and then inside the gaps of those there are smaller stones that help to fill those voids and add stability to the structure. We generally recommend field stone, which is the rounded stones as well, and these allow ice to come in and kind of roll up that ramp instead of just sort of bulldozing into it. And that's another key feature, or another key reason that we use that gentle slope as well, because the steeper the bank, the more the waste pushes into it instead of sliding up. And of course we have our coir log there. We got a filter layer of gravel that keeps the sediments of the lake bottom from coming out, being pulled out by the waves between the field stones, and of course our native plants in the background. Some people like to use a geotextile or a landscape fabric underneath the field stone. That's something we try to recommend not doing, and the reason is that we put these native plants here behind the coir log, but what we want to see is that over time they're moving out, they're growing into the coir log, they're coming up amongst the field stones as well, and that just creates a more resilient and stable structure. So this is just an example to show you, how we kind of figure some of these things out. So we have a site in Indian River area, and we look at the fetch, this red line that is, in this case, the longest fetch was 6.5 miles about. We can calculate the expected wave height from that, which was 2.6 feet. And then we have an average rock diameter based on that wave height of 11 inches. And we have the smallest rocks were about 5.5 inches, and the largest rocks were about 16.5 inches. And all those combine into the fieldstone revetment. So here's a picture of a project that the Watershed Council did a number of years ago on Intermediate Lake here in Antrim County. So we had a failing seawall that wasn't doing its job anymore, and we did install the coir log and the fieldstone revetment. This is the site a number of years later. So you can see the red line there is where the coir log was. You can't even see it anymore because the plants have grown into that log and even past it. So they're moving out into the fieldstone now. We've got a lot of sediment that has washed in and is rebuilding that shoreline. So most of the stone is actually covered up here, and the shoreline is actually rebuilding itself while the neighbor's property has continued to erode and recede. Just want to touch on a couple of the other techniques that we sometimes use. So this is called encapsulated soil lifts, and this is just a diagram here. Basically you have erosion control blankets that wrap around soils that are filled back in and then are staked into the ground. And those biodegradable erosion control blankets provide structural strength to the soil while the plants are getting established. Eventually they'll break down like the coir logs, and the plant roots will be holding everything in place. So we put native So we put native plants on top of each layer. We put them between the layers as well here. Usually a series of terraces are created. And this is good especially for sites with steep banks where we don't have, a lot of room to make a more gentle slope back from the water. So here's a picture of a site with soil lifts shortly after installation. Here you can see there's two different terraces. They've got some field stone in the front to protect the toe of that slope. They got the native plants that have been sort of sandwiched between the two layers there. And then we have the same site 2 years later on the right, where the native plants are really thriving, and you really can't even see the soil lifts anymore. The title of this got cut off, but this is aquatic native plants also provide a lot of shoreline stability, and especially some of the emergent plants like the rushes and the sedges, cattails even. These, as the wave energy comes in, when those plants are dense, they're absorbing a lot of that wave energy and making the waves that come in and do hit the shore are going to be less powerful as a result. They also have the impact of reducing ice thickness and helping ice break up quicker in those areas. And if you've ever seen, like at the base of a tree, like towards the end of winter, there's often no snow at the base of the tree because the sun is hitting that tree, it's warming it, and you get a little area of melting right around the base of the snow. So imagine the same thing happens with each of these rushes here. The sun hits that, it's warming the ice at the base, and it's making it thinner and less strong as well. Another option is something we call woody structure, or in Wisconsin they have a fish sticks is what they call it, or turtle logs is what I think Michigan is starting to call it. Basically, this is adding wood, logs, and trees to the lake. So when I showed that first picture of the undeveloped shoreline, and there was forest right up to the edge, we used to have a lot of dead trees in the lake. And this provided tons of habitat for turtles, for birds, for fish. Fish love this woody structure, and they just flock around it. So this table here shows a study by Christensen and his colleagues. And on undeveloped shorelines, we might have 600 to 900 logs per mile. On developed shorelines, we have 92 logs per mile in this particular study. So like an order of magnitude difference there. And this has had real impacts on the habitat value in our lakes. Additionally, as the waves come into these structures, if they're installed correctly, that wave energy is kind of dissipated and broken up, so these can also help protect the shoreline. And then this is just a picture of what that might look like. This is in between Crooked and Pickerel lakes here, but there's a series of logs that are placed along the shoreline. And in this case, I actually think this was a natural structure on this undeveloped shoreline here. Where it was. All right, so just to review sort of these different bioengineering techniques, we talked about green belts. This is really our only preventative one. The others are things that we would do after there's already erosion problems. Green belts, we talked about sort of, what are the requirements. We want to focus on our workhorse species, the shrubs, the trees, and grasses and sedges, and also looked at different things affecting the green belt width. When we have a little bit more energy, we might want to add a coir log to that green belt to help it get established. When there's wave energy beyond that, we want to add some fieldstone. In some cases, we use soil lifts. Aquatic native plants, again, help to attenuate that wave energy as well. And woody structure for breaking up that wave energy and creating good habitat. And of course, these can all be used in combination, so you're not limited to just using one. I also want to take a quick look at looking at the shoreline property at a more comprehensive look. There's a program called the Michigan Shoreline Stewards that you can look up on there's a website for that, and it's not showing up really good in the bottom of the diagram there, but there's a card in the back if you're interested that has the information on it. But this program looks at sort of a holistic approach to the shoreland and what are the ways that we can protect the lake from that perspective. So this includes things like on your upland parts of your property, that would be looking at stormwater. So how can we minimize stormwater runoff? That might be through things like minimizing impervious surfaces. So it could be things like having a certain size house for a certain size lot. You might use permeable pavers or some other means of infiltrating soil into the ground, infiltrating runoff into the ground instead of having it run off into the lake. Or maybe a rain garden could help capture some of that runoff. It looks at things like what is our fertilizer and pesticide use? What is are people picking up pet waste? Are they getting their septics pumped and inspected regularly? How are they addressing erosion? Do they have a green belt? All these kind of things. So I highly recommend checking out this website. They have survey for shoreline property owners that kind of walks them through what they're doing on their property and kind of gives them a score and gives them some feedback about ways they can improve and helps educate them as well. And with that, I can take any questions if we still have time. So.
No, how do regulations how do regulations affect shorelines, or what regulations are in effect for doing some of these things?
Yeah, so some of the regulations that I'm at least familiar with are things like setbacks for housing and other construction on shorelines. That's a big one. Some local governments have greenbelt ordinances that require greenbelts of a certain width, and they have things in there that also regulate, what's the composition, what does that look like. So that can be a beneficial way to protect water quality as well. There's sometimes in the zoning ordinances, there's restrictions on how big of a house you can build for this lot size. So that kind of ties in again to that impervious surfaces and thinking about that. So is there any other things that I'm missing here?
Yeah, there's also going to be Eagles Part 301 and Part 303 regulations, which are regulating inland lakes and streams and wetlands. Those regulations are going to look at things that are right next to or below the ordinary high water mark. The ordinary high water mark is the mark on the land that is caused by the successive changes in water elevation. The ordinary high water mark is the highest place where you can see that water reaching throughout the years. So if things are happening below that mark, you are also going to have to deal with Eagle's permitting process. If you're on an inland lake, you own out to the center of the lake. If you're on a Great Lake, your property more or less ends at the ordinary high water mark. So there's going to be some difference from inland lake to Great Lake.
You may have just answered my question. I live in an inland lake, and because of the high energy, I have a real gradual riprap going out. Now, how far out can I go with that? And now, it sounds like I can go as far as I want to the middle.
So, it's kind of complicated. So, one is you are supposed to only really be building landward of the ordinary high water mark. Eagle has an inland lake permitting process where there is a minor permit category that allows you to establish riprap. It's either 6 or 7 feet, but I believe it's 6 feet waterward of the ordinary high water mark. And if you are planning to put riprap further out than 6 feet, it becomes an individual permit category that goes to public notice, and it is under different administrative processes. You do own the bottomland out into the lake on an inland lake. However, you are not allowed to quote unquote reclaim land where you're sort of like sticking riprap out 10 feet and then filling in. That's not allowed.
I'm good.
You put Casey on the spot here before. I'm going to ask Kyle if I could put him on the spot here for a minute. When you go out, both Noah, Kyle, and I think Sam could probably speak to this as well. When you go out and are asked for consultation with a homeowner, perhaps, what are the biggest problems that you see? Not from the standpoint of what physical conditions you find, but are the homeowners, the property owners, are they aware of what their responsibilities are? Are they aware of the things that they can and cannot do? Are they aware that they live in an area where there's an ordinance about cutting a tree down? What are some of the biggest things? And then, what would you suggest to us and the people that are the leaders in our community making ordinances and rules? What could we do to either educate or perhaps enforce? We hate to get to enforce because then it's probably too late. So would you mind sharing?
There's a very wide range of understanding from homeowners and even the municipalities as far as what is required or what's allowed. Just the question there about how far out you can put your riprap. There's so many layers to it between local government and state requirements and all of that. And it varies per township. And per villages too, because a lot of it comes down to local zoning regulations. But then there are the basic state requirements as far as what can be done in the water or adjacent to the water. Central Lake, I guess I can go Elk Rapids specifically since that's more relevant to us here. The township of Elk Rapids has a buffer ordinance. The village of Elk Rapids does not. We don't have anything that says what you can do at your shoreline. But the township does, so they say anything within the first 50 feet, you have to maintain, I think it's 70% of your woody vegetation. So it's difficult for homeowners especially to really tell, because you don't deal with that on a daily basis. It's something like you notice, hey, my shoreline got absolutely destroyed by the ice last summer. I'm gonna call Mel's Excavating and have them come in and fix my shoreline, but you don't know that you need an eagle permit for it, and then you have to go through this whole process, and then if you wanna go 6 feet out into the water, it's not a big deal, possibly, but if you think you need to go further, or you wanna use bigger stone, it goes through public notice through eagle. So, there's so many different layers to it, and it's so difficult for people to really get those good answers. I don't know if there's really a good answer. It's a lot of times the contractors have a pretty good idea and they can help with it.
Do they?
Some of them do. There's, and I'm sure Casey has the same issues, right? There's some good contractors and they all do good work, but whether they're environmentally conscious or not is maybe a different question. So I think a big part of it is just educating, and it's from individual township and municipality standpoint, the knowledge at that level, of your local governments, of what the requirements are, or who they can go to get those questions answered, being able to direct people to that is really important. Just the education and outreach of it, so that people are more aware. And lake associations are great, and I think that's what you deal with more is the lake associations being able to, especially with new members when they come in, when people move into the lake, let them know, hey, these are the requirements on our lake per state and local regulations. So again, it's all education and getting people to think about it, because if you're coming out from Detroit, you probably don't have any idea that there's something called a buffer ordinance in Elk Township or whatever the case is. So.
We'll let you know this is similar kind of issues when you get called out or you observe.
Yeah, I think I would agree with what Kyle was saying. So when people are having shoreline erosion, it's often a cluster of people that are neighbors to each other, and one of them decides, hey, I'm gonna get some big boulders in here and protect the shoreline, and the neighbor sees that and it's like, well, I'm gonna do that too, and the contractors love that because now they get 2 or 3 houses that are all in the same area, so it's easy for them in terms of staging and working efficiently. But again, like, some of them are good contractors and some of them are not. So we had a case where there was a contractor that said, it's only so many feet of shoreline, I don't need a permit. But that's not the case. It doesn't matter how long of shoreline it is that you need that permit from Eagle. And that's what they're telling the homeowner. So the homeowner doesn't know different. They're thinking, this guy is an expert, I'm gonna leave it all in his hands. So
If any of our whose would you suggest they look at as kind of, what's your model ordinance?
I'm gonna turn that one over to Al, since she's more familiar with the ordinances than I am.
Milton Township has a pretty good ordinance. There's about to be a new model. I'm currently working with Bay Township on Lake Charlevoix on a ordinance that we're hoping to get rolled out in the next couple of months. And the way that that is structured is it requires a green belt, but it also has a shoreline advisory committee and also a site plan review process for any work that's being done on that shoreline. And the purpose of that is to allow township officials to actually have those discussions with the property owner prior to that work being done, so that you can take site-specific considerations into account and recommend best practices and have that educational conversation prior to any work actually being done. So we're hoping that that can be a good model for local governments as they try to navigate these questions of, hey, there's a house that was built a very long time ago, or there are these particular project purposes that they want to accomplish. How do we make that happen in the most environmentally sensitive manner while accomplishing project goals?
What about Walloon Lake, which has a major organization that has been very effective at acquiring undeveloped properties? Have you looked hard at that? I mean, it's pretty good.
As a management tool or as a regulatory framework?
As a way of preserving undeveloped property.
So that is okay. I'm gonna take a side step and avoid your question entirely.
Okay.
So I'm gonna say that there is value in ensuring that there is vegetated buffering area around the lake, but that it is specifically there's a values question implied in that, which is, what do we want this lake to look like, and how do we accomplish those goals? And that is something that I'm not going to tell you how it should be, because that's something that you as leaders around the lake need to decide that. I will say that Walloon Lake has a very interesting administrative process that they are going through, and I will happily chat about it, because they are trying to ensure that the local governments around the lake have a administrative and governmental structure to have those conversations to determine things like, how do we make a uniform ordinance? How do we coordinate our enforcement and visioning processes so that we all know where we're headed? And I think that that administrative process is very interesting and could be very useful for you. But I think the specific question of, is it a good thing to buy up parcels, is necessarily subsumed under the, what do local governments want to accomplish, and what is their vision for that area? Neatly sidestepped. All right, so I am gonna move us along here. So it is 10:45. At 11 o'clock, we were planning to have lunch. So I am going to give you until 11 o'clock to discuss shoreline issues. What do you want to see? What are your questions? What are your concerns? What more information do you want to have? What additional resources do you need? Have that conversation at your tables. At 11 o'clock, we're gonna let you take a break. Then we're gonna send you off to grab lunch, which is over there, and George is probably gonna give you more information about that. And then over lunch, while you're eating, we're gonna have a facilitated big group discussion. Sounds good? All right, chat amongst your tables.